Welcome back to Pahor in Translation, the podcast where we look at the works of Boris Pahor, a Slovenian writer that lived in Trieste. And today we will be looking at his short story, Flowers for a Leper. My name is Eleanor Jaffe Pachulo, and I will be focusing on center and periphery in this short story.
I'm Liv, and I'll be focusing on the dichotomy of the individual and the collective.
My name is Ronke, and I'll be focusing on history versus histories. So today we'll be talking about a short story named Flowers for a Leper. It was written by Boris Pahor, and it centers around the kidnapping and poisoning of Loise Bartuș.
The short story combines the outward events of his kidnapping with his inner dialogue and subconsciousness. Loise reminisces on the beautiful landscape that he will never see again, Gorizia and the Isonzo River.
So this is actually a true story based on Loise Bartuș, and he was a Slovenian composer and choirmaster who resisted the Italianization imposed by the fascists and was punished for it. On December 27th, 1936, he was kidnapped by a group of fascist blackshirts who forced him to drink a mixture of castor oil, petrol, and motor oil. He was then released and died of the punishment 2 months later in a hospital in his hometown of Gorizia. So to get us kicked off, I'd like to ask the question so we can kind of, initiate the discussion. How do you all think Flowers for a Leper contributes to the conversation about your respective themes?
I'll start. For me, one thing that really stood out was when he was describing the choir singers, he just kind of mentioned the women. He didn't really point out any one woman. He didn't point out any defining features. And to me, that he wanted the women to be described as a collective. In that moment, he was really emphasizing the women as a collective force for good. And he wanted to elevate the symbol of music.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think we had also talked about a similar thing going on with the black shirts, correct?
Yeah, again, he didn't provide any specific identity, but in this case, he wanted to highlight the dark side of collectivism, like when it was manifested as nationalism and fascism. He didn't want to humanize them in any way. He wanted to show that they were this dark and horrible force that were killing people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, speaking of the black shirts, I think that's kind of where I would connect primarily my theme to this story, just because I think I've heard of the term black shirts throughout my education and stuff, but this story really highlights how they really did enter into people's lives and take them away, make them drink these mixtures, it just kind of gives a story of what the black shirts actually did. And it's not something that you learn about growing up. At least I didn't. So I think that it kind of interjects into history with this little personal story.
Yeah, I think focusing on the personal here, and connecting to my theme, I think the center of the story is Loise. I don't think even the events that happen to him are not exactly the center of the story, because when it falls into his subconscious in those two paragraphs where he's talking about the river and he says that when he was suffocating from the river and the river turns into oil, and these are all his sort of hallucinations and subconscious emotions and manifestations of his turmoil that was going on in his own mind while dealing with the fact that he was just poisoned. I think the center of the story becomes the person, and I think that is the histories, because histories is just what happens to any one individual, what happens to one small path in the larger
human experience.
Exactly, the larger human experience that happens in capital H history. And I think at the periphery then of this story is both the black shirts, the women, and he really does make the individual the center and the collective the periphery.
Wow.
And I think that's what he does in a lot of his work. And I think that's what makes it so beautiful and so it lends itself to connecting with the reader, I feel like, because it's making you see like a whole person. And I think a lot of stories don't let you see a whole person. They let you see bits and pieces of a person.
Mm-hmm.
What you brought up about like having Loise be the center was really interesting, because I noticed that when the black shirts were looking for him, they called him by his Italianized name, Luigi Bertossi, but his Slovene name, Loise Bratuj, we never found out his true last name. He was just called Loise in the story, and I was just kind of pondering, like, why did Pahor not include his Slovene last name?
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think we sort of touched on this in class once, talking about kind of. I mean, I think my perspective is sort of like he's the guy on the block that everyone knows. He's this big figure in the community, and he represents so much. So he's able to be known as just Loise, right? Like everyone knows him.
And I think Loise, not Loise Bratuj, is singular. It's even more singular. And I think that is even more almost highlighting the individuality of somebody when you call them by one name, like Beyonce. Beyonce is just Beyonce. You don't need to know that her last name is Knowles. Like, it doesn't matter because she is Beyonce. Or like Shakira is Shakira, you know?
Yeah.
And I think it's that same sort of idea where it's like somebody's individuality is so powerful that they don't even need a last name. But maybe the Italian black shirts don't even see him as that like wonderful musical powerhouse. They see him as just another name on the list of people that they need to arrest. So I think there's that sort of contrast there between the Slovene name and the Italian name.
Yeah. Even to that point, like, the whole effort of like the fascist sort of Italianization movement was to kind of take away individualism, right? Like, you need to become a part of this culture, you need to assimilate, become a part of the collective, so that we're one machine moving together. So naming him Luigi Bertossi, right? Like, he is just like us. Oh, they don't acknowledge him as just like them, but they're trying to like push him in, take away this Loise like persona as this individual symbol.
Slovene, yeah.
Right.
And now
just
he's
wipe
just
out that.
Now he's just Italianized, and he's
Right.
I mean, it's part of the whole entire like Italianization movement that Pahor talks about in his Butterflies on a Coat Rack, which I think was a lot of our one of our favorite stories with Julia. Do you guys remember her real name?
Yes, Yolka.
Yolka, yes.
Yeah.
So he touches on that a couple times, like how stripping somebody of their name, like how do you guys think about that? What importance does a name have to your identity?
To me, like, I talked about the butterfly and the coat rack in my podcast with Claudia, but to me, like, like the Italianization of her name stripped her of her individuality. It stripped her of her culture. Like, it really stripped her of herself. Like all these things, like your culture, your name, like your true name, make up your identity. And when the fascists were like doing this Italianization, they were really taking away people's identities.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely true. And like I think about what my name means to me, because my first name is OBTA, right? But I go by Ronke. That was a choice. Well, okay, let's talk about it this way. Okay. So in an American accent, it's Ronke, right? The way that it's truly said is Ronke. So OBTA Ibi Ronke Ako is my name. And I kind of chose to go by Ronke when I was younger, just because everyone called me Ronke at home, but then when I got to school, people would pronounce it Ronke. It lent itself to more nicknames and stuff. But then I think about like why I didn't like my first name, and it was because of the bullying that I faced a lot of the time. Um, I was also told a couple things about what the significance of the name is in like Nigeria, basically, which is like has a bad connotation. People told my parents not to name me that, but I won't get into that. But
No, get into it. Get into it. So Obitia is your first name?
yeah,
Obitia?
OBTA.
Obitia.
Yeah. So it's my paternal grandmother's name, her first name, and then my middle name is Ibironke, and that's my maternal grandmother's first name. So I just took their names, right? Which there's a lot to pack there. Like I don't really have an identity of my own, if that makes sense, by taking on someone else's name. But yeah, so OBTA, I'm not even sure what the exact meaning of it is. No one's ever told me, but there was like speculation that it was a curse, and that like, obviously anyone listening, fact check me. I don't know, but that's what I was told my whole life, and so I was like, oh, and I think that kind of deterred me from it, anyways. But then I faced bullying in school. People would like, pick on me just for my name. So I went by something else, which I guess I'd always really gone by it at home, but if people read it out loud in class, they would make fun of me for it. So I think the name is really personal to me, like Ronke, both of them mean something to me. But I do still carry a bracelet that says OBTA on it, and like my graduation sash says OBTA. And I think like there's something that I can't really understand that makes me want to still hold on to that and remember like who I am, but then remember like those are kind of two different people, but also the same person at the same time. So,
Yeah, and I think names are so personal, and one person, you could view it as sort of on the periphery of your existence, right? Like, oh, what does a name really mean? But I think for a lot of people, it becomes sort of center because it's like a manifestation of your identity. And I think like we see this a lot with like younger people, I mean people actually of all ages transitioning male to female, female to male, either one or coming out as non-binary and choosing a new name. And I think that to me highlights how much a name can mean when your name is problematized. Like my name isn't problematized. I don't have any issues going around with Eleanor. Nobody has bullied me for they've said it's a grandma name, but okay, like that's not bullying. But it's like it hasn't become a sort of that front and center issue of my life. But when your dead name connects you to an identity that you don't even associate with or connect with at all, then it's problematized. Or when your name, Ronke, is like people are literally bullying you for your name, it becomes part of like that. It's like almost a resistance to write that name on your sash, to have that bracelet, to carry that name despite what other people think, I think is resistance. And I think that's what, Julia versus Yulka is to me, and that is what Loise versus what's Luigi is.
Wow.
And it's a resistance to keep a name that other people don't think you should have or bully you for or literally persecute you for.
Totally.
And so I think names can be literally synonymous with somebody's personal identity depending on the situation, or they could mean nothing and they can be pushed to the periphery when you have sort of the freedom of not being persecuted, bullied for your name.
Yeah, and it's also like how you go around signing it everywhere, right? So it means something to you no matter what. But then you think about like a cultural, like a name attached to a culture, a tribe, a language. Like Ronke means I have someone to pamper, I believe. Whereas I don't know what OBTA means, right? But like, your parents give you these names with like an idea of the meaning in mind. So if you do connect to that name, that identity that the name is connected to, the name can mean even more, and it's the same for language. Yeah. Like the language you speak, it's how you communicate who you are, pronouns, all those things. Like, so when someone like strips you of the language that you use to express yourself, that's just,
Yeah.
you know, stripping your name, all these things, it's just absolutely horrendous.
I mean, I think that's such an important point to bring up. Like you said, like expression. I think somebody's expression, and this is what Flowers for a Leper brings up, right? Music is his form of expression. It was the girl's form of expression. He says, if I could just read this quote, give me 1 second. He says that, I'm so sorry. Where's this? Do you guys know where the quote about the grandmas is? Okay, well, I will just paraphrase. Okay, could you find it?
The singing. Okay, so they were bathers of the free Sonso, but they were still girls who were secretly learning forbidden songs, the songs of their grandmothers.
Right.
The melody
stood out to me as well.
Yeah.
That stands out.
I think later on he also said like the singing had ennobled the atmosphere. Like to me that communicates like the singing, the music like gave the atmosphere something good. Like in a society where there is so much like hatred and oppression, like the music was like a positive force.
Yeah. And essential to their culture and to their heritage, like their grandmas. And I think that's what Veronica is bringing up. Like when expression is so connected to your culture, and expression is who you are at the end of the day. And I think like to take away music for some people is to take away a lifeline.
Yeah, that's definitely how it is for me. Yeah, I think even like there's a way to connect that to this question that I have of why do you think Pahor put such an emphasis on land in this story? Because it's like you guys said, like music is so vital to their culture, to their expression. And I feel like the way Pahor uses references to land or nature is so central. Like he turns his characters like he turns his characters into extensions of like forests, leaves, flowers, you know, butterflies, persimmons, like, you know. So what do you guys think about that?
I definitely agree. I actually have a few quotes written down here that stood out to me. Like he wrote, "The Gorizia, the countryside, lay sleepless," and then although the song, like from the choir, was melancholic, the countryside let out a sigh of relief. Like to me, like he's using the countryside to personify the collective, which in this case is the Slovene community. Like he's connecting the land to the people.
Yeah, I think there's another quote that connects it to Lozje in particular. It says that when the sun's rays shine perpendicularly, they appear as golden ropes to the tortured prisoner seeking to escape from the deadly well. Like he relates the way in which the land moves with the emotions of the people in the story. And I think like Liv brought up with the other quotes too, it's like you can't, I mean, it's almost like the people are inextricable from the land that they were that they grew up on, and the culture that grew in that land.
Yeah, and it's like it sounds like he also used that quote as like a way to say the people use the land for like to gain their freedom. Like they find their freedom in the land, and I don't know, however it helps them express themselves. And like there's this album by India Ari that like the cover, I think it's her 6th album, it's like Songversations Medicine, and it's her face made out of leaves. Like she has her signature headdress on, and then like the red lipstick is made out of 2 red leaves. Like, and I think what really stood out to me about that, because I'm like analyzing these album covers and I'm thinking, what is she trying to say here? If she's trying to say anything at all, what am I trying to make her say is what I'll say. And I think it's like it's a, I don't know, like she kind of finds power in literally becoming nature on this cover. Like, and it's kind of like saying like I am God's divine creation, like the land that you step on. And in terms of like this whole Black is Beautiful movement, or this like message of like celebration of your Blackness that she has in her music, that's what I connected to, like this nature thing. Because when you connect yourself to nature and you acknowledge this, you're kind of saying like I am undeniably beautiful. And I think the same thing.
You are in God's
presence.
Like if Mother Nature, right, is God, and God is Mother Nature, and sort of you are created in God's image, especially if you are, spiritual. I think like that spiritual connection to land and self is extremely powerful.
Yeah. I think Pahor does it with that intention. I would assume he does, like, kind of to make, like, to solidify an unbreakable bond between, like, the people and their land.
Yeah.
Like, no matter what you try to do, like, this is where my family, either is from or, like, has housed themselves. Like, I feel connected to this land. You cannot take this away from me. This is what I am.
Yeah. And this brings up the idea of Madre Patria, right?
Yeah. It's like, what? Okay, so there's a patria as, like, your fatherland versus matria, I suppose. And then it brings into this conversation, why did people choose to refer to, like, land as, like, mother? Why are people bringing up women mother when a lot of people do bring up, like, patria, fatherland? Like, it just kind of highlights this importance of women in literally every context ever.
Yeah, and I think Pahor like does see not only the importance but the lifeline that women are, like they are the foundation almost, I would say, in his works.
I agree, especially this work. Like, I mean, the women are the one that are providing this, like, positive source of music. And then after Loise passes away, when the guards are blocking the tombs, like, they literally burst through to get to the tomb, and they were able to put flowers down and crowns. And even when they couldn't go in anymore, they threw it over. It's like they were used as like, he symbolized them as a force of resistance against the Italianization. And like they kind of took over, like, after Loise's death. It's like they are taking on this, like, act of resistance that he started.
Powerful.
Yeah, and I think he specifically says, like, it wasn't the men, it was the women who knocked down the gate. And I think, like, that sort of that power that he gives them is reminiscent to the power of the Isonzo that he talks about, right? Like this river, this, like, force of I mean, women are a force of nature, I think, is what he's saying. And nature is a force of nature. And, like, that connection between women, land, and his own identity as a Slovenian, or this Loise's specific identity as the Slovenian, like, choir master, is like, there is that connection between all three of those aspects that, despite him dying, like, that connection to the people and to the land never dies.
One thing that I found interesting was that he called, like, first of all, he called it the free Isonzo. And then, second of all, when I was doing some background research, like, I Googled Isonzo, and then it was kind of hard to find, but I found out it was, like, the secondary name of what is called the Socha, which is the river that flows from Western Slovenia and northeastern Italy. And I was just like, it stood out to me, like, I wonder why he chose to use the Italian name instead of the Slovene name.
For me, I think this question came up with me as well. And for the listeners, if you would like to see the Socha or Isonzo River, that we do have a map on the page associated with this episode. And when this came up for me, I was like, maybe it's because he talks about in one of Loise's dreams the Isonzo turning to oil, and it's like flooding over the crops and it's suffocating him. And I think, like, maybe it's the idea that the Italians are weaponizing their own land against them. Some sort of, something's turning on them. I feel like there was it's definitely connected to the fact, like, using the Italian name is like, it's not my land that turned on me. It was somebody else who's almost using my land
Right.
against me.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, because I mean, if it flows from Slovenia to Italy, right? Like, it's like saying Slovenia and Italy are connected. Like, so when you try to, I don't know, if it turns to oil, as in like when he was forced to drink the oil, Italy is forcing this oil, this toxic, content into this sort of, I'm gonna say, like, pure Slovenian, like, essence, and you're kind of tainting it, even though, like, we should be one, like, in the sense of, like, you should still, obviously, like, I'm Slovenian, I'm Italian, or however you identify, but, like, we shouldn't be tainting each other. Like, you shouldn't be attacking me. Like, we are connected.
Yeah. There's this, and I think that's the collective in terms of Pahor. I think by focusing on the individual, by giving this individual story, he still shows how the collective plays in to every individual experience. And I think he recognizes the pains, the sorrows, the joys, and the experiences that are universal to every person. And I think, like, the Asumza River is a great example of that. Like, it is an experience for both Slovenes and Italians. Like, they both have access to this river, and I think, like, it carries with it sort of that shared consciousness, that shared experience that all humans go through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's like a big occurrence, or like a big theme, I guess, in the story, just because, like you said, like, it evokes like thoughts of the collective, and that's what a lot of this story does for me, the individual versus the collective, and that even brings into conversation the universalism and particularism debate, and that's like to me, this is like a story about collective grief and like a universal or national pain that comes from, like, via a particular experience, right? So
Yeah.
it's just like I don't know, like, blurring the lines between like universalism, particularism. Like, should we, focus on these particular details? Should we be more universal, less focused on like the subject, sort of thing? But then this shows you the power of focusing on the subject, because you can get a universal message from a particular experience.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think that's kind of what Pahor does in his writing, like in general. Like, I mean, he has a particular experience of like his time in the concentration camps, which is different from other prisoners in the camp. Yet I think his works communicate like a universal message. And like he's ultimately like he's giving like a platform to talk about like the types of abuses that like prisoners would like suffer in these camps.
Yeah.
100%. And I think, like, one of my questions when I was reading the story that I wanted to hear your guys' like opinions on is, like, how does Pahor's narrative use sort of literary devices, and how does it use imagery to reinforce the narrative?
It's a really good question. I mean, it seems like you're gonna have to help me on this. Devices. The simile metaphor thing has always been groggy in my head. One of them uses like, right?
Simile is like or as.
Thanks, Queen. Okay.
And then metaphor is just saying something is something. So, like, for example, right now I'm sitting in my room and I see my pothos growing in front of me. I'd be like, the pothos is the, sorry, I'm blanking on a metaphor here, is growing I'm literally blanking on a metaphor. If anybody has a metaphor, feel free to interject. I'm like looking around my room, like, what can I make into it? Well, okay, actually, sorry. Do you know what? Keep answering the question, and I will go find a metaphor in his work instead of giving one of my bad metaphors, because I'm sure he has some amazing ones that I've highlighted.
Yeah, he's got a lot of similes, it seems.
Okay, so wait, here, sorry. Literally already, after reading 2 seconds of my highlights. I already found one. So if you have a blue night, right? Like it's just described as something, even if it's not. A sparkling sky.
It is a sparkling sky,
Yeah.
Right? It's not actually sparkling, but it is.
I feel like he does simile a lot more. Like
he uses simile
That's
way
true,
more.
yeah.
right. Like I see he does it all the time. Like when he said what the town, he describes the town, like the people and stuff, and he'll be like, right here it says the town was silent like the body of a drowned man that unaware so and so had abandoned on the shore. He just makes these really big, like usually you'd be like the town was silent like a mouse, like, and then he's like, oh no, like the body of a drowned man. Like he just makes these rich visuals and just makes you feel the pain that you're reading with the simile. Like that's the biggest thing that stood out to me.
Okay, I found a good metaphor in here. He is talking about, like, Loge is now in one of his, like, sort of subconscious, his, like, I don't even know what you would call it, like a...
Hallucination?
Hmm?
Hallucination?
Yeah, I guess it's a hallucination. I don't really know how to characterize those two paragraphs, but I think, yeah, like a vision, a hallucination. He says that, and he is seated again. He's talking about himself, Loise. And he is seated again and plays the harmonium. And the hair of the young girls floats around him and smells of spring forest, a green forest, all green. So he says, like, the hair floats and smells of spring forest, right? He's not saying like or as. And I think he actually uses quite a bit of metaphor rather than simile in the hallucination. I think that distinguishes between sort of the real and the subconscious, because like in your subconscious, when I'm in my dream, it's not as if I'm flying on a pig with wings. I am flying on a pig with wings.
Right.
That's the state you're in. Yeah.
You know? So it's real to Loise in that moment. And I think the reason he uses simile so much and how that pushes forward the narrative is that it still roots things in the real. I feel like he uses simile more because it starts in fact. It starts in particular. It starts in these experiences that are grounded in reality, but then gives you the imagery by comparing them to perhaps something that is not real or something that is more palatable to the imagination. And I think that's what beautifies reality, is through his simile.
I'm glad you found that metaphor.
Yeah.
That was fire. I think I saw that one and thought about the nature thing, like his love of like describing people as nature.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And then just kind of like touching on what I mentioned before, like he personifies the countryside a lot, like when he said the Gorizia countryside lay sleepless and the countryside let out a sigh of relief. And just once again, I think he wanted to make that connection between like nature and like people, and like how nature is so like we were saying, like nature is so like interconnected with like the people and culture.
Right. And so he uses personification, simile, metaphor, all as these sort of collective literary forces, I think, to push forth the more broader themes in his narrative. Like, has obviously these very particular stories he needs to tell that he's telling, but the way he makes things applicable to every day, every life, every time. Like here we are probably 45, 50 years later after this story was written, and this is still applicable because he has these themes and this imagery and that really allow us to see beyond just the facts.
Yes, ma'am. All right, everyone's just making really bomb statements. Okay. We gotta wrap it up apparently, and I want to ask one more question. I was wondering what you all think of, like, what do you think is the greatest presence or lack thereof in the story of any of Pahor's narratives? And to kind of like, explain that question, I would say like the greatest presence slash lack to me was silence. And like how it spoke so loud in his stories, like Butterfly on the Coat Rack, the kids were silent watching the teacher, holding him accountable, eyes were on him. And it's like, you know silence brings attention and accountability. And Pahor kind of flips silence on its head, because usually silence is like present alongside things like injustice and like when a crime is not being seen or when it hasn't been acknowledged, but he uses silence to acknowledge and to hold people accountable and to commemorate. So what do y'all think like is the greatest presence or lack thereof?
Well, I love that, first of all. And I think that is also applicable to this story in terms
Agreed.
of like the singing, right? It goes silent. And that's when accountability is had. And that's when the community mobilizes in protest and, kind of literally walks over the black shirts to do what they believe is necessary, to sing to him from the window, all these things. So I think that was perfectly applicable to the story, but I have to ruminate a little bit more on what I think is the most.
Wait, I wanted to add one more
important.
thing to what you
No,
just
go ahead.
said.
Yeah, please.
That just made me think of when he was like force fed the oil, like he couldn't sing anymore. They cut off his ability to sing, and that was like, to me, that's another presence of silence. Like he
Yes.
lost, like music was like the positive force, and like that force was effectively shut out when they gave him the oil.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Yeah, he even talked about like I think he feared like not even what was coming, but just like not being able, like he was basically like having his voice taken away is what he feared, right?
Yeah.
And the whole like town, and I'm sure like the entire like Slovenian community that was aware of what was going on felt that. And the silence, like when it's quiet, you're like gonna look and be like, why are they quiet? Like in a classroom when everyone was like laughing and then like everyone starts to quiet down, everyone's like, oh, super awkward moment. But anyways, but yeah, like sorry, but yeah, like it seems like it really does like make people turn and acknowledge. You have to go to where the silence is, pay your respect, be like, why are we silent? Like what are we trying to, change?
Yeah. No, I think that, like, honestly, I'm struggling to think of like another thing that I was more present, because I think that was just so beautiful. But I do think that what stood out to me, I guess, when I was first reading this, and I'm not going to go too much more in depth because we've talked about it a couple of times already on this episode, is I think for me what was most important was the scenery, was the land. I mean, he talks about Nanos, he talks about the shepherds, he talks about the sun, he talks about the river, the place. Like, to me, the way Pahor describes someone's home, the way he describes the place you're in, the way he describes sort of like these inanimate surroundings makes for I can't, I mean, again, we've talked about it. I just think like it makes for a story that is really grounded. There's no other way for me to express that. I just think it's a very grounded way to like push somebody into somebody's mind, to somebody's experience, is by describing what's around them, what matters to them, how does their home affect them. That's all I'll say on that. I'll let Liv go ahead and tell us what her like the most presence was for you,
Or lack of.
or lack of.
Okay, for me, I think I will say in like this story and the butterfly in the coat rack, it wasn't as present, but I would say especially in the necropolis and the persimmons, and even like the address on the axis, time was like a bit major thing that stood out to me. Like when he would go into flashbacks, like it seemed like it was kind of the present time. Like everything the way he would describe his flashbacks was so vivid. I felt like that was what I was reading right now. Like I think, and that I think is a testament to like for him as to like how much these memories have affected him. Like his
Mhm.
like in for Necropolis, it's like his memories in the concentration camp. In the Persimmons, his memory with Nico. You know, I think he just uses time in such a way that like he makes the past feel like the present.
Yeah. He makes the past like I think I've said this a couple times in class. Like for me, he makes everything feel like I'm there. When he uses it's the imagery at the end of the day, but it's also just the way, the detail that he includes and the way that he talks about his experiences really transport me into that moment, and I'm able to embody the character for a little bit while reading, and I think that's beautiful, and I think that goes back to what we were saying about the particular and the the individual.
Yeah. Thank you guys for amazing answers to that question. Speaking of time, we're out of it and we gotta go. But thank you for spending your time with us on this podcast. And I hope that, I don't know, this was a fruitful conversation for you to listen to, and that you will take the time to check out Boris Pahor. He's a man that really left a mark on us. So thank you.
And also thank you to Nina for a wonderful class. We're gonna miss you. Thank you.
And thank you to the UCLA Italian department for sponsoring this podcast.
Just icon things, yes.
And yeah, so make sure to check out the website and check out our page that is linked with this episode. It will have a bunch of accompanying materials.
Thank you again, and goodbye.